Say, we certainly, there's lots of raising funds through the diaspora. That happens a lot. But usually, apart from some organizations that are well structured, we tend to do that informally. For example, if there's a crisis in our countries, usually there's a moral panic. You would get a call from your friend and your cousin and say, we're raising money for this. All of that happens a lot. But we actually don't know how much, because it's not done in a structure. It doesn't go through a registered organization. We know that the money is well used because the person organizing it collects enough money and something is done with it. So most of that is not counted. But at the fall, we recently did a piece of work in collaboration with the Cass Business School. Cass Business School is part of City University in London, and they have a charity and philanthropy section, and they're starting to study the behavior of giving among the diaspora community. But one interesting fact they found, which amazed me, and this is a scientific study done entirely by the academics, that the African community in the UK are amongst the most generous donors to charities in general, not to African charities, but charities in general. So they also found a link that those who send remittances are more likely to make donations to charity, which perhaps it makes sense to you, but I was slightly intrigued myself when I first heard that. And I said, are you sure? They said, yes. I said, please do not tell the big NGOs, because then they would go next to Western Union waiting for Africans and say, give me some money. But so I think certainly in the UK, and all of us should start thinking, kind of getting a better understanding of that sector, because I think there's a lot of mileage there, that if it's organized. So sometimes we have these bad negative stereotypes for ourselves, that we are not generous, we are not do this. It's not true. It's not true, because we give a lot. Sometimes we complain, we've given it to one person, we don't know what's happened. Generally, they've done and use it for good use, generally. But I think what we need to do is bring a bit more structure into it, so that those organizations become more formal. Then you can count the money, because we're missing out. All of those that are going through informal structures, we're missing out on the tax relief. And in the UK, the tax relief is 25%. 25%. So if I give them money to charity, like Afford is a charity. If you are generous enough today before you leave the room, and each of you give 1,000 kroner to Afford, if you were in the UK, for every 1,000 kroner, the government would give another 250. That's how generous it is. Sorry.
It's the fact that for some people benevolence has become a part of their life.
Yes.
And in Denmark, for example, I experienced that the people are willing to pay the taxes, which is very high, for getting a return.
Yes.
But there's a difference between the way we give, because we just don't give money, we also give time and effort.
Yes.
And that has to do with benevolence.
Yes.
So I've done a little bit on philanthropy.
Yes.
And it's been very interesting to study some of the organizations in Denmark.
Yes, indeed. And yes, it is true that we give in very many other ways. But just on this measure of cash, which if you look at it against the general public, people may think, by the way, what this study recognized at Cass Business School was not necessarily just for African diaspora. They noticed it for all of the diaspora. They studied the Indians, Bangladeshi, and Sri Lankans as well. And it was the same for all of them. But just on that measure of cash given. And one of the interesting, because I went to one of the briefings, and before they published, and the researchers were telling us that some of those remitters, they did not equate their remitting to charitable donations. So many of them gave statements like, oh, the amounts I'm remitting to my family, that's not charity, that's an obligation. So sort of that one, I don't even count. So that's just an obligation. I'm still doing something else. And of course, amongst the diaspora communities, you also have many who are very religious either they're Christians or they're Muslims, very religious, and feel it as a religious obligation to give out alms. All of that is kind of linked. So the bottom line about this is there is much more opportunity within diaspora giving, and it's slightly underdeveloped and not modernized in terms of using the instruments that are available to us in these countries that we live. So maybe that's something that in each of your countries you might want to think about, and it's easy to do some research and some policy development around it, because you will find an academic institution that already does study on charity or philanthropy mainstream, and they would be more than happy to work on a diaspora-related thing. Yeah? Did you have a comment?